All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Steve Smith. I'm co-founder and CEO of Intellispark. I'm joining you today from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Intellispark reaches about 125,000 students in more than 400 schools across the country, and we try to help educators better meet students' individual support needs by helping schools know the name, face, and story of each kid. Education is in my DNA. My mom taught first and second grade for 30 years. My father spent his career as a high school English teacher, then assistant principal and principal, all in the New York City suburbs. And so it's been a privilege of mine to devote more than 25 years of my own career to supporting K-12 educators. Today's webinar focuses on Denver Public Schools' innovative work improving high school success by measuring and teaching resiliency, something that we at Intellispark are very proud to support. And our guest today is Dr. Samantha Haviland, who serves as Executive Director of Career and College Success for DPS, where she's worked since 2012. Earlier in her time at DPS, Sam was Director of School Counseling, and before that, her background includes working as a school counselor in various rural, suburban, and urban districts. She's passionate about helping Denver students and their families, and in her role, she supports all work-based learning, student engagement and dropout prevention, college success and school counseling, rigorous coursework, and career and technical education, with the overall goal that students can dream, plan, and achieve greatness in their own path after high school. Sam and I would love to invite you to participate directly in the conversation, and I'll ask some questions. And while we can't see or hear you, we do encourage you to participate through the chat and through the Q&A. And we'll do our best to monitor that and get to topics that you bring up so that this is most helpful to you. I'll use your comments and questions to inform the discussion, so please do share what's on your mind. One of my colleagues will help me monitor the chat and will occasionally add context or references or links that you may find helpful. The session is being recorded and we'll make it available online in case you'd like to share it with a colleague. So be on the lookout for 2 emails from us afterward. One will have a certificate of attendance. The other will have the link to the recording. So without further ado, I am pleased to welcome Sam and to kick us off with the first question. So Sam, you and I got introduced when Intellispark acquired ScholarCentric, which was a resiliency program, is a resiliency program that helps you both measure and teach resiliency skills. And I know that you've been using that for years, even before Intellispark got involved. So can you tell us a little bit about that history?
Yeah, happy to. Before even my time in Denver Public Schools, a researcher who developed the tool worked with my predecessor in school counseling to develop a longitudinal survey that followed our students and then was duplicated in other school districts to look at resiliency skill indicators that could identify the longitudinal impact on dropout prevention. So we have worked with ScholarCentric since probably 2011 as a district on the resiliency with the longitudinal. I think the survey was initiated maybe 2007 and then further grown as a research body. So it's been a large part of what we do and a huge strategy that we use that has had significant impact on our dropout rate and our graduation rate, which from prior to my time, our dropout rate was somewhere above 12%, and we float around 4% now. And this was one of maybe 3 major strategies that we used.
Wow, that's fantastic. Can you just, for those who may not be familiar with what resiliency is, can you just help us understand, what is it? What are you measuring? And then how does that translate into how you better support students?
Sure. So the resiliency survey is, I believe, 108 items in English and also in Spanish. It can be read to the students as well, which really helps us to administer the assessment. And it measures 6 different skills. It's a skill set that we're looking for. Those 6 subcategories, and I always forget one, and it's never the same one, so you'll catch me on this one. But relationships, intrinsic academic motivation, stress, well-being. So the difference being well-being would be, are you eating and sleeping? See, this is always, I missed 2.
I have a cheat sheet with me. So the other 2 were academic confidence and valuing education.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And so all of the items ask various questions, and they are, from a research standpoint, weighted based off of the significance. And then we are given, both at the individual level and then at the school level and the district level, the data. So a student, it's scored on the bell curve of 1, 2, or 3. If a student got a 3, that means that they've got a real strength and they're in that upper quartile on the bell curve. If they got a 2, it's neither a strength nor a challenge for them. And if they got a 1, then it indicates that that is a challenge for the student. We take that data, and again, we look at it from an individual student level. What does this individual student need for interventions? Then we look at the aggregate for the whole school. What is a whole school need? What kinds of character development curriculums do we need to put into place, or whole child, which has been very important during COVID, as we see a large portion of our students are struggling in very different ways than they traditionally had been. And then we will identify interventions for small group strategies, relationships, creating relationships within the school, as well as your teaching and at home, your teachers and at home. It is an easy intervention that we can run within a school day that does not cost us much money. So we take that information and we combine it with the traditional research, with the attendance, behavior, and credit that I think everyone is well aware of, the Chicago studies on that. But what we like about the resiliency data is the data is not outcome data. And if I can explain a little bit, attendance, behavior, and credit attainment are all outcomes that have already happened. A student is already not attending, or they're already not passing their credits. But the resiliency is a predictor. So a student might not show up in the attendance, behavior, credit indicators yet, but is showing up as needing help with some of the resiliency skills so that we can do interventions. Anybody who's worked attendance and dropout prevention knows that once a student stops attending, it's very hard to get them back. So anything we can do on the front end before any of that shows up in actual behaviors in school is really valuable.
No, that's super helpful. And I appreciate you're making the distinction between indicators of problems that have already occurred versus the ability to try to intervene early and prevent some of those outcomes. So can you, just to provide some foundational information for folks who might be interested, my understanding at least is that you use the resiliency assessment with all 8th graders across the district. Is that right? And how does that play in to the students' transition from middle to high school?
Yeah. So yes, we administer the assessment to all of the 8th grade students in our district-run schools. So close to 4,000 or so students. It takes 30-ish minutes to administer in any of our schools, and our middle schools all do that. And then we have it as a part of our greater dropout prevention strategy that plays out through the spring and the fall planning for our high schools. So after the assessment is completed, then we get the data to our middle schools so that our middle school administrators and counseling staff, psychs, social workers, gifted and talented, special ed teachers can all look at the data and try to do immediate interventions with students as the data comes in. And then in April, what we do, because we are a school of choice district, so I don't have very natural feeding patterns between middle and high school. A student could go to any high school that they wanted. So we, based off of where students have enrolled, then create new spreadsheets with all of this data, notes from the middle school, and schedule time in April for middle school staff and high school staff to talk student by student. And so they will literally go down the list of these 172 students are transitioning from Lake Middle School to North High School. And Lake Middle School knows our students. They have worked with those students. They know what's going on with the family. They know how the student responds to certain interventions, what's been most helpful. And we also transition that resiliency data And the second half of the day then is a planning session, and that's for high school staff. So again, it's administrators, counselors, gifted and talented special ed teachers, all meeting together to look at both the individual lines and the aggregate of the students that they are receiving, so that they can plan interventions either over the summer with doing home visits and welcoming students and families into their community, all the way to immediate interventions that need to be put into place for August when students return. And we all know that, again, with attendance, behavior, and credit, the first 90 days are very important in ninth grade as predictor for dropout. So we create plans then for the first 90 days of what interventions need to be taken into consideration, so that any staffing models that need to change can change in advance. Any additional programming, mentoring, engagement strategies, well-being interventions can be put into place for students almost immediately.
So you said something really interesting that I didn't know before, that because Denver's did you say school of choice district, right? Students can go anywhere. And so in some ways, it sounds like that has really raised the degree of difficulty here for trying to implement a program like this, because students are not necessarily moving as a cohort from middle school to high school. Is that a fair assessment? And
it adds additional challenges. The hope being that a middle school student is able to identify the high school that best fits their needs, both from a size and location standpoint, but also from a programmatic lens. So what CTE programs is the school offering, what clubs and athletics, all of those things. But it can make the transition from middle to high school feel very chaotic for a lot of people, because where one high school and many school districts might just go focus on their feeder middle school for transitions, our students might get on public transportation and go an hour away from home, which isn't unheard of, to go to a magnet school or something like that. So yeah, we just have the added bonus.
So in addition to having 4,000 students, they can go all sorts of different places. So, okay.
And do. Yes.
And do. So, I think what also was interesting, and just as I was listening, you were describing having data at a student level, as well as having data at an aggregate level, whether it's a school level or class level. And so I want to dig into that maybe just for a minute and think about, is there anything that this has helped you to do differently, either, at the middle school, because they now have this assessment of kind of their whole 8th grade population that might inform practice there. And then we can come and talk about high schools in a minute, but just thinking about that middle school, like, was there anything that stood out to you that you learned or that you were able to change in terms of middle school practices?
Yes, and it's very aligned to the American School Counselors Association model, right? The model for school counseling, where when you get data, that's your initial data, you create a plan with it, you execute that, just as all continuous improvements cycles do. So it has brought in additional supports, summer programs. Like many people, we have used our ESSER dollars to expand some of the summer programs. And that's not just from an academic standpoint, but also a social emotional standpoint, and an engagement strategy. So I would say it varies wildly, depending on if we're talking a small handful of students, 20% of students, or 70% of students showing up. We have seen an increase in need for students in well-being specifically, and stress, as well as some want for relationships. And so we have adapted.
And who at the middle school is directly involved? I mean, is this a principal level initiative? Is this led by the counseling team? Are teachers directly involved? How does that all interrelate?
Sure. So yeah, I would say the great majority are the counselors. We do have some middle schools that do not have counselors, where we have identified maybe a dean, maybe an 8th grade teacher who focuses with those students, who knows the students best. so that they can put the interventions in place, but also that conversation between the middle school and the high school staff of really the nuanced details. This student responds very well to stickers on their desk or something, I fill in the blank there, but so it's largely implemented by the counselors. The administrators are very aware of the data. And then from a high school standpoint, it's principals, assistant principals, and counselors, because it is a whole school model.
Mm-hmm. And do the teachers play a role here, especially as the student then moves into high school? Like, how does a teacher come to understand the resiliency data? And did you have to do a professional development workshops with teachers? I'm just curious how that has worked, given counselors probably would naturally gravitate towards some of this from their own professional training, but for some teachers, this may be new.
For teachers, it definitely is new. And teachers, that's a bit of a harder population and a little bit more expansive than just the counselors. So I would say the teachers are more aware of the interventions that are being offered to which students in the schools than they are the nuanced details of the data behind the resiliency. So they have the action plan more than they do the input data. They have access to it. I'm not positive how often they are referring to it on
right. And are these interventions, because you mentioned a couple times that the resiliency data helps you to identify interventions that might be useful either on a population basis or even with individual students. Have you developed a standardized set of interventions across the district, or do schools develop their own? How does that work?
We have a standard set, and we also have partners that, we use Generation Teach quite regularly as an academic intervention for self-confidence. And they also do great work with social justice and SEL stuff. Where we might say, this is our recommended partner, this is our recommended intervention. Our schools, we're a school district of about 88,000 students that is quite expansive and then varies quite significantly, both in the community opportunities that are available to students and families, as well as the student population and family strengths. So while we will provide from a district level a list of interventions and things that we might recommend, we do want them to create their own. And there might be partners that the school works with that they're very familiar with that I have less eyes on or less familiarity with. So it's a yes and to that question.
Okay, fair enough. So I want to maybe try to steer this toward some practical advice for the other attendees who are on the call right now. And as you mentioned, in the history with ScholarCentric for Denver goes back 15 years or so. And so this has become part of the embedded practice. But if you were starting from scratch, or you were talking to a colleague in another district who said, this sounds interesting, but I just don't even know how I might even go about getting something like this off the ground. Can you help, share some wisdom from your own experience?
Sure. And I do want to put out there the transitions day that we do in April, that's between middle school and high school staff, where we display this data, has been reported for years the most favorite day of both our middle school and high school staff. They find it the meatiest. When it comes to professional development, the most rewarding. They're excited. They get to look forward to the next year and all their students. So when it comes to motivation, we've not had a significant struggle in putting it into place. I think everyone is so curious about their students. Both the middle school is curious about how their students are experiencing their lives in education, but also from a high school standpoint. I will say the few times, so we have district run schools, which I can regulate more their practice, versus charter schools, which I have less ability to regulate. And our high schools have been real instrumental in having that conversation with our charter schools, where I will still pay for the assessment. And I need the charter school employees buy-in to administer it. Once, we're all educators, we're all in it for the same students. That conversation alone is enough to typically bring a staff member to the table, and it's not a heavy lift. I would say this assessment from an administration standpoint of like start to finish for a school, because we essentially hold the contract. We work with our tech team to get licenses out to our students. At that point, it's pushing into a classroom one at a time, getting them on their laptops and administering. And like I said, so, on a bad day, it might take 35 or 40 minutes to administer. And so for the amount of information that you get back about a student and the planning that's available, I would say implementation is very simple overall.
And to be very sort of tactical about this, students are completing this during class time, or do you assign it to students to complete outside of class, or does it vary?
I would say our biggest model is to administer it during class. I know that's not always popular, but I find the schools then have to do less makeup work or following down, tracking down or following up with students and their families. And so it takes less time to take the class time to administer it than it does to follow up with all of the students who failed to follow through. Middle school brains,
Right. And are parents included in the conversation about the resiliency data? And if so, like, what kind of feedback have you had there?
Yeah, we have had those conversations, and I would say that varies by school. Some schools are very much about sitting down with the individual's parent, which would be my recommendation with this information. One thing that we're very clear on is that this assessment is about resiliency skills. It's not necessarily like an assessment of talent, or I'm never going to tell a parent that your student is 100% going to drop out. And if we can work together and partner together on what your student's experience is, knowing this, what resources do you need from an academic standpoint or just a well-being standpoint that the school can help with. And so those conversations, I'm unaware of any conversations that went negatively. The parent is usually grateful for the thought partnership and the overall goal of getting their students to the finish line.
So I just want to, we're a little bit past the halfway point, so I just want to amplify a comment that Tricia put in the chat, which is if anyone has additional questions that they'd like me to pose, please do join the conversation. We'd appreciate that. But Sam, something you just said in terms of kind of involving parents, I want to pull on that thread just a little bit more. And, I think we hear a lot about conversations about social emotional learning, of which resiliency could be considered a part, that can be challenging at times, that there's some concern whether in some communities, whether that's even a school function. And so I'm curious if that's come up at all in Denver, and sort of how resiliency, how you've navigated those kinds of conversations, if they've come up with resiliency.
I am very fortunate to live in a community of individuals that are very supportive of the mental health and the educational landscape, parents included. So the social emotional learning has been a component in Denver Public Schools from a universal curriculum standpoint since before COVID, but during COVID, we then further regulated our social emotional learning curriculums and the time spent, where we ensured that 100% of DPS students receive social emotional learning, either 20 minutes or 30 minutes a day. With that, we very much have that conversation where this is a part of the services that we provide, similar to math instruction. We do not deny any child access to social emotional learning. And we have the conversation around the skills that we're teaching, that you can call them 21st century skills. I've had this conversation with Castle as well. These are employability skills. These are the skills that most likely are going to shine when a student interviews for a career. These are about being a healthy and functioning adult, and not intended to manipulate or brainwash or influence students in any sort of way. Just help them to improve self-management and advocacy and relationships among each other, and with teachers. And I would say, because we have started down the path of social emotional for adults as well, I get more pushback from the teachers about administering or supporting social emotional learning from a teacher standpoint than I do from students or families.
Yeah, interesting. And I do want to just reiterate a point that you've made a couple times, which is we're talking about skills that are really universally applicable. These are skills that will help students in school. They will help students outside of school when they're young. They'll help students as they grow older. And I think the other piece that's just important as a takeaway is that we are talking about skills that can be taught. So you made an interesting comment just a couple minutes ago about in the conversation with parents, this isn't judgment. This is an opportunity. This is assessment for learning, not assessment of learning, right? So we can use this to help get skills development resources for students where they may have some gaps.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. These are movable things. They are not static.
Right. Skills, not traits, right?
Exactly.
Absolutely. So now I know you started your career as a school counselor, and we have a lot of school counselors that are part of the Intellispark community, a number who are with us today. So I'm just wondering if you can maybe reflect a little bit on your development of your own career, moving from school counselor at a building level to a district administrator overseeing school counselors and now serving in a major school district. You know, what that's put you in an interesting position to be able to advocate for the work that counselors do. And I'm just wondering what you've learned from that experience and what you might be able to share with colleagues who are trying to make sure that that work stays as a priority as everybody faces, you know, their budget cycles every year and other challenges.
Sure. I mean, one of the key things that I have done is based on the research behind school counseling and identifying what a school counselor does. I know ASCA has put out there appropriate versus inappropriate duties for school counselors. I've tried to move away from some of that language to talk about, from a business standpoint, are you getting the bang for your buck? You're paying for a master's degree. Are you supporting someone with a master's degree in achieving that work? And in Colorado, one of the love languages of an administrator, and I know this is true everywhere because it's in No Child Left Behind, but is about the accountability framework. So in Colorado, it would be the colors, you know, our school is red versus our school is green. And it means a lot. There's a lot of pressure for administrators. In which case I see it as a love language, but also a way that we can tie school counseling and school counseling duties to the movement of that accountability framework and all of the data. So dropout prevention is an example that shows up in our accountability framework. Attendance, achievement. There are interventions that your school counselor should be running on a daily basis to ensure that that data moves. They should be tracking data and progress towards that. And with that is often the discussion around, I hear you, I understand lunch duty is very important. The safety of our students is very important. And so that we don't remove students from English instruction, where they would have to remediate the content that they missed, lunch is the ideal time for our school counselors to run small group interventions so that it doesn't interrupt the academic learning of our students. With that, and I very closely actually mapped school counselor duties to the accountability framework. A lot of our administrators are actually holding school counselors accountable to holding groups during lunch and making sure that they're moving progress instead of asking them what it is that they're doing on a daily basis or questioning their value. So we really flipped the script on that in Denver. And because of that, our high school counselor ratios are, I need to pull up my spreadsheet, they're lower than 1 to 300. I think they're closer to 1 to 275 at the high school level, but they go down as far as 1 to 60 or 1 to 70, as the school counselor is seen as one of the primary leaders in the school environment.
No, that's really helpful. I certainly couldn't do a webinar in 2022 without talking at least a few minutes about COVID and how that's affected education. And we'll just at the outset say we know it's been a challenging few years, really across the board. And schools have struggled with issues around equity and mental health and academic achievement being exacerbated by the effects of the pandemic. But in other ways, maybe the pandemic encouraged us to break out of our shell a little bit, maybe do some things a little bit differently. So just wondering if maybe outside of the challenges, whether there were any silver linings that you've experienced over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think there's, well, so first of all, a shout out to my team and all of their work. We had the highest graduation rates in DPS history with the class of 2020 and class of 2021. We're waiting on our class of 2022. So there's certainly silver linings. And part of that is we have done really deep analysis of our policies and our procedures to look for ways that we have maybe been stuck in traditional thinking. We, have remained comfortable in the policies that have perpetuated systemic racist systems. And then we've questioned them. And so I think there was a lot of opportunity for growth in there where we rethought a lot of education, even all the way down from master scheduling and having fewer courses on a quarter versus more courses on a semester, and saw some really amazing data with those items. Otherwise, I would say our students gained skills in a lot of places that traditional school has not taught. And there are some of those skills we still need to adapt as a system towards, I would say, and this is, I'm sure some of my colleagues would say this too. I had some high school students that got jobs and are contributing to the family unit with those jobs, and those jobs are during the day. And we don't have an evening school system set up. And so we need to consider that. How are we serving our students and their varying needs better and differently? And so I would say it really gave us a great opportunity to stop looking at education as the way we've always done it.
For sure. And that's really amazing to know that even in that environment, that very challenging environment of COVID for the last 2 years, that graduation rates were actually setting records in DPS.
Yeah.
So terrific. So I just wanted to give you a chance, anything that we may not have covered, any other closing comments that you may have. Again, as probably the most experienced district administrator in the country with resiliency, with this assessment, whether there's anything else that you wanted to pass along to this group.
I do genuinely think the data is very interesting. Stephen, I think I told you this, but I used the data to write my dissertation and do my own research with my students for those coming from other countries, and are their skill sets different? Because a huge portion of this isn't just how a student is struggling, but also where a student is thriving, and how do you use how they are thriving to support their engagement strategies and their graduation, their overall goals and careers. So I think that's a way to use the data and to look at the data that has a lot of opportunity for it, and specifically as we look to get better every year. So.
Well, and I'm so glad that you brought up the point about thriving, because it's easy to kind of fall back into sort of a deficit mindset as we talk about opportunity areas for growth. but recognizing that one other thing that this assessment can do is help you identify areas of strength that students can build from as well. So I want to thank you again, Sam. It's been a pleasure talking with you this afternoon. And please do visit our website, intellispark.com, if you want to learn more about our work, or follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook if you want to stay in touch about future events. Have a wonderful rest of the day, rest of the week. Happy holidays, and thanks so much.